The cross or crucifix is such a central figure in our churches, in our homes and in our faith. In this series I'm going to be looking at 6 examples of the cross, of the crucifix throughout the history of art and seeing what they can tell us about our journey of faith as a church, about what the cross can say to us today and about how these representations have changed over the years. Welcome to 6 Crosses. Hello and welcome to the 6th and final episode in our mini-series for Lent on depictions of the crucifixion throughout the centuries. We've come a long way since the year 200 and that little scratched piece of graffiti mocking the crucifixion. We come all the way into the 20th century and we're going to look at a picture which in many ways encapsulates so much of the 20th century. We've come to the year 1954. And the artist Salvador Dali. Now, you might immediately be thinking about which representation of the crucifixion I'm going to show you. If you think it's Christ of St. John of the Cross, you're wrong. It's actually this one. This one which is called Corpus Hypercubus. Now it is, as I warned last week, modern art. And so it's a very unusual picture. What we've got to do is try and unpick exactly what this representation of the crucifixion is saying, what it means, and perhaps especially what it can give to us as we stand on the verge of Holy Week this year. Salvador Dali was a very unusual and interesting character. Though he was baptised and initially brought up as a Catholic, he actually turned away from faith entirely, becoming a self-professed atheist as a member of the surrealist art movement. In fact, he wasn't just an atheist, he was in many ways very anti-religion, and a lot of his artworks are not the sort of thing that I'd be showing you here from that period. After the Second World War, though, he had a complete change, a complete conversion experience. He came back to the church and became an extremely devoted Catholic for the rest of his life, and that was reflected in his art. He moved away from the sort of surrealism that he'd been working on before the war and began to produce a remarkable number of extremely dense religious images. Now, these religious images continued to use certain elements of surrealism, certain elements of the style of art that Dali had been working on before the war, but they're also a completely new style. They were, in a sense, a sort of a realism that went beyond realism, a sort of mystical realism in art. Now, there were many of these. Some of them perhaps you might have seen. I've already mentioned Christ of St. John of the Cross, one of my favourite paintings, hanging up there in Glasgow. But there's also works of art like the Madonna of Port Ligat, which was a painting actually presented to the Pope in the 1950s. We've got a painting called the Ecumenical Council. There's a very famous one called the Sacrament of the Eucharist. I'm going to mention this one again later on. Lots and lots of these religious artworks, but as you can see, they're all very dense with meaning that we've got to try and interpret, we've got to try and understand. So to return to the painting that we are looking at today, the Corpus Hypercubus, what on earth are we looking at? At first, it might look as though this is just the artist painting a bizarre 3-dimensional cross just for the sake of it. But actually, there's something more going on here, because that cross that the figure of Christ, the corpus, is hanging in front of is actually a very important figure in theoretical physics. In fact, I first saw this representation of the crucifix not in a book on art or a book on religion, but actually a book on physics. This book, Hyperspace, by Michio Kaku. And I was quite surprised when reading through this to see this representation of the crucifixion appear. But it's because of that strange cross. It's actually called a tesseract. Now, any of you who are fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe might immediately think you know what we're going on about, but no, unfortunately, they use the word tesseract to describe something completely different, so forget all of that. A tesseract is this three-dimensional shape which is made up of 8 cubes arranged to form this three-dimensional cross. A tesseract, and this is where it really starts getting extremely complicated, a tesseract is an unfolded hypercube. A hypercube is a 4-dimensional cube. Now, as I say, this is where it really starts getting really complicated. The idea of more dimensions has been really important in physics, in theoretical physics, for over the past 100 years. And it's something which has brought about a lot of the new understandings of the nature of the universe. Things like string theory or superstring theory. It doesn't work without more dimensions. How to understand multiple dimensions? Well, I think we're all familiar with the idea of the difference between 2D and 3D. Two-dimensional and three-dimensional. Two-dimensional is flat, like a computer or phone or TV screen that you're looking at the moment. What you are seeing is two-dimensional. If you like, from where you are, what you see is height and width, but there is no depth, okay? The screen itself is completely flat, so you've only got 2 dimensions, that height and that width. Now, if we were in the cinema and I was a special 3D showing, you might have been to the pictures and actually seen a film, you know, where you have to wear those funny glasses. 3D, 3 dimensions, means that you get the third one. As well as the height and the width, you get depth. That's the special effect in 3D films, that you get the idea of depth. Things seem to jump out of the screen at you. So 3 dimensions, height, width and depth. Now, the idea of a 4th dimension is that then you can add something else in addition to width and height and depth, but it's got to be at right angles to those 3. So we can't even begin to see it. We can't even begin to picture it. But theoretically, it can exist. Just as if you were living in 2 dimensions, you could actually imagine what 3 dimensions might be like. I mentioned that the tesseract, the image of the cross that we've got here, is an unfolded hypercube. Well, that's in the same sense as which, if you were to take an ordinary cube, a 3-dimensional cube, you can unfold it into something flat, which coincidentally actually is the shape of a cross. In the same way that the flat 2-dimensional cross, we can imagine folding it up into a 3-dimensional cross, so the tesseract, we have to sort of imagine folding this into a 4-dimensional hypercube. I've probably completely lost you at this point, but don't worry, these are huge thoughts. What's the point though? What's the point of imagining 4 dimensions? Well, it's all to do with an understanding of the depths of the universe, how the universe works. How did it come to be what it is? How is it? What will it be? I mentioned things like string theory. Theoretical physicists are always looking for ways to try and understand the why and the how of the universe that we inhabit. And this idea of multiple dimensions is something which has allowed them to develop these theories. Multiple dimensions take us beyond. That perhaps is the most important aspect of this, and this is where I think this painting by Dali is actually trying to take us. The 4th dimension is something which is beyond our experience. We are 3-dimensional creatures. We are in a 3-dimensional cosmos. But the idea of a 4th dimension is taking us somewhere else. It's taking us beyond. Now, Dali, I think, is using this image, the tesseract, in this painting very deliberately to try and make us think of the crucifixion not just in its 3-dimensional form. In other words, an event that really happened on that hill of Calvary in Jerusalem 2,000 or so years ago. He wants us to try and see the mystical dimension of the crucifixion, of that which is completely beyond that single point in space and time. Now we already have an understanding of this, because we believe that the power of the crucifixion of Jesus already reaches throughout space and time. Though we are not in Jerusalem in the year when Jesus was crucified, yet we believe that through the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, somehow we are part of that moment, that mystery of his crucifixion, what he actually achieved by going all the way to death, even death on a cross. It wasn't just located in one point in space and time, but it reaches throughout space and time. The tesseract that Dali uses here in this depiction of the crucifixion takes that even further. The crucifixion is not just an event that stretches throughout our three-dimensional space and time, but it stretches through every dimension, through every possible universe, through everything. The idea of this painting is to try and open us up to see the power of the crucifixion as being a truly cosmic event. This makes me think of lots of things. I am a bit of a science geek. I do like science, though I can't profess to understand it all. As well as my other understandings and loves and likings like history and art and religion as well. But science has always fascinated me because of its attempt to try and understand what is. This painting by Dali and that idea that it's taking us beyond the simply physical into the realms of science makes me think of two things, two little sort of wanderings that I want to offer you today. First, about the relationship between religion and science, and secondly, to that idea of just how the crucifixion can be an absolutely multi-dimensional cosmic event. So, first, let's have a think about science and religion. Dali, when he returned to the church, obviously this was a period when there were so many advances being made in science and technology. One of the things that he talked about his art of this period was to describe it as nuclear mysticism. Remember, this was after the atom bomb, the developments of nuclear power, all the works of Einstein and the Manhattan Project, and all of these developments that were creating a new world and a new understanding of the world. Well, Dali was taking that scientific experience into his religious experience and creating a new mysticism, which didn't just say that there was no contradiction between science and religion, but actually fused them, that blended them together, that said that they were actually parts of the same whole. In many ways, this is the Catholic Church's current understanding of the relationship between religion and science. Now, this is not the case with all Christian churches, and it's certainly not the case in history. As soon as you start talking about the church and science, people will immediately refer to Galileo Galilei, the Galileo affair, hundreds of years ago, when he, who proposed something that we all now know to be true, that the earth revolves around the sun, he was condemned for heresy, put under house arrest by the church. And a lot of people say that this was the church just digging its heels in and refusing to accept the truth, refusing to accept science. I think that the Galileo affair was a lot more complicated than that. There were all sorts of other things to do with the understanding of what exactly heresy was, and also personality clashes as well. You can't point to the Galileo affair as being the defining moment of the church's relationship with science. One of the things I find fascinating is that not long before that, the church actually had made a major scientific discovery that had an impact on the whole of Europe and indeed the whole of the world. There was a priest who was a scientist, a mathematician, called Christopher Clavius, who'd been asked to look at the way in which the year was calculated, the calendar was worked out. People up to that time had been working on what was called the Julian calendar that had been brought about by Julius Caesar hundreds of years before, but it had gone wonky. It was wrong, it didn't measure the year exactly. And so as hundreds of years have passed, everything had got out of sync. Christopher Clavius and a Vatican team actually looked into this scientifically in order to try and determine how the year, the calendar, should be calculated. And they actually proposed what we now call the Gregorian calendar after Pope Gregory XIII. That calendar was promulgated and began to be used by countries throughout Europe. It did mean a certain number of days got lost. Because obviously when the calendar was reformed, things had to be shifted. I don't know if you've ever wondered why your taxes go from April the 6th to April the 5th. It's to do with the change in the Gregorian calendar. Previously, taxes were all paid on Lady Day, which was yesterday. the Feast of the Annunciation, the 25th of March. But with the reform of the calendar, those missing days got taken out of the calendar. But rather than lose those days' worth of taxes, our government shifted the tax day forward to cover the missing days to April the 5th. So when you come to your tax return, it's all to do with Vatican scientists working at the end of the 16th century. So the church and science are not enemies. If you watch things like, read things like Dan Brown's Angels and Demons, or you've seen the film, he tries to say that there was this war between the church and science. That has never been the case. As I say, the Galileo thing, perhaps that was an exception. But we often find that the church has been very eager to engage in scientific research. Many religious figures, many priests, have been actual forerunners in scientific discovery. There's a list that you'll probably hear everywhere of people like Gregor Mendel, who was an Augustinian monk in the 19th century, who was a great pioneer in the work of genetics. You've probably heard of Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian Jesuit priest, who was also a theoretical physicist, who worked with, amongst other people, Albert Einstein, and who was the originator of what we now call the Big Bang Theory. Not the TV series, but the idea that the whole of the universe, that everything began from a singularity, a minuscule point of everything, and then expanded in a dramatic, sudden explosion, a big bang, to create the universe that we are now part of. It was Georges Lemaitre who actually proposed that theory for the first time. In a sense, it can be best summed up by one of the modern, current, present-day Catholic scientists, a guy called Guy Consolmagno. He wrote a fantastic book a few years ago called God's Astronomer. Guy Consolmagno I think he's a Jesuit, but he actually works for the Vatican Observatory. Yes, the Vatican has got its own astronomical observatory. Well, it has two, actually. There was one at Castel Gandolfo, just outside Rome, the Papal Observatory. That one's not used anymore because of all the light pollution from the city of Rome. The current Vatican Observatory is in Arizona, and that's where Guy Consolmagno works on some of the most cutting-edge research into things like gravitational waves in the universe. But Consolmagno talks about science and that examination of the cosmos as being entirely coherent with his faith. What he discovers about the universe is a discovery about God. What the universe teaches us is a learning about God. If science shows us something to be true, then that must belong to God, because God is truth. So the church would say that we have no reason to be scared of science. There is a complementarity between science and religion because they are working in a sense in different fields. Science is very much concerned with the whats and the hows, whereas religion in a sense concerns itself perhaps more with the whys and the whethers. Science can say, yeah, we can do this, but religion's job is sometimes to say, well, should we do this? There's the moral and the ethical concerns. That was very much expressed by another writer called Stephen Jay Gould. He wrote this book called Rocks of Ages, which is all about the relationship between religion and science. And he talks about them as not being in conflict, but they complement each other. They ask different questions. They look at the same things in different ways, but there must be a coherence, a cooperation, a collaboration between religion and science as we try to unearth the truth that comes from God. So, go back to our painting, Dali. He brings a pure scientific image into a religious event. He brings this tesseract, this whole idea about multiple dimensions and how the cosmos works, into the historical moment of Jesus' crucifixion. And he's proclaiming there that we don't need to be afraid of science. We don't need to be afraid of those things which probe the universe to understand the what and the how, as we consider the why, as we consider the meaning of those things. So, don't be afraid of science. It's not a scary thing. What science reveals as true, we believe it reveals something of God. And we have to be grateful for technology. The very fact that I'm able to talk to you in your home today through this video the very fact that we can have computers that help us to not just watch things like this, but research things and find out all sorts of knowledge. The fact that science is creating things like vaccines that are helping us out of the coronavirus pandemic. That, by the way, is you getting this late on a Friday, because I had my vaccination on Wednesday and I must confess it completely knocked me out yesterday. So apologies for the lateness of this episode. But the fact that that vaccine is there, this is what science is doing to actually help enhance our life, as long as we still have that power to just ask those why questions, the whether questions, to keep an ethical and a moral element that, as it were, works with science to make sure that it is going in the right direction. So, don't be afraid of science. That was my first point that this painting made me think of. The second is that idea of this multi-dimensional cosmic significance of the crucifixion. A few years ago, I think it was around about 2014, Pope Francis did something that he does quite often, which is he shocked the world's media by something he said, an innocent comment. I don't know whether someone asked him a question or where it actually came from, but the headlines went absolutely bonkers when the Pope said that if he met an extraterrestrial, I think it was actually a Martian that they were talking about, and that Martian wanted to be baptised, Pope Francis didn't see any reason why it couldn't be. But of course, as I say, the media went absolutely frantic about this. One of the big questions that a lot of believers struggle with at the moment, scientists are looking for things like evidence of life on Mars. You know, there's a new NASA rover that's trundling around there, gathering samples to try and look for the traces of life, or even the elements, the building blocks of life. And some people are either afraid of or actually keen that this would somehow take away our faith. If life is discovered on another planet, well, the Bible, our religion, our God, it must all be wrong, must all be made up. And I think that what Pope Francis was saying was, no, not at all. If there is life on Mars, if there is life on other planets, well, that's God's life too. God was responsible for that. If God is the creator of everything, and remember, in the church, we simply state that God is the creator. We don't simply state how that was created. The Bible gives us poems, images, stories of creation. If science gives us other stories of creation, there's no reason why they can't be right. So the church isn't bothered about the how God created everything, but just that God is the creator. So if God created our planet, God also created Mars. If God created life on our planet, then God can create life on Mars, or in any one of the billions of planets in our galaxy, or in any one of the planets in the billions of galaxies in our universe. There is no contradiction with our faith. This was expressed actually by a great writer that you've probably heard of, C.S. Lewis. Now, most people know C.S. Lewis for his Narnia books, you know, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader and so on. But he wrote so many other things, the Screwtape Letters, which are all about temptation and sin. But he also wrote 3 science fiction novels that actually, they are theological science fiction novels. They're now often known as the Cosmic Trilogy. They are Out of the Silent Planet, Perilandra, and That Hideous Strength. And they're all about voyages to our nearest neighbouring planets, to Mars and to Venus. Now, what C.S. Lewis is saying in these books is that the God that we believe in is the same God of Mars, the same God of Venus, the same God of the whole solar system, the same God of the whole universe. Now, the story of God's involvement with our Earth, with our human race, is, according to Lewis, only one part of the much bigger story of God's involvement with other races, whether they are Martians or Venusians or from wherever. And the same God who sent his Son into our world has a plan for any race, for any planet, for any solar system. So the idea is that our God is the God of everywhere, is the universal God, the cosmic God. And life on other planets, extraterrestrials, aliens, whatever you want to call them, do not undermine our religion, because our relationship with God is only one part of that massive cosmic relationship that God has with all of his creation, whether it's us or whether it's a galaxy a long time ago and far, far away. So that's science fiction, but there's a theology in there. What's this got to do with the crucifixion? And what's it got to do with Dali's painting? Well, in Dali's painting, that deliberate use of the tesseract, this reference to the fourth dimension, to that which is beyond our human existence, I think is pointing to the same thing, to a God who is so much bigger than anything and everything. Not a God that we can shrink to our world, to our small three-dimensional existence, but a God who is so much bigger than everything else. This, I think, opens up the crucifixion to something amazing. That moment when Jesus dies on the cross is, in a sense, truly the centre of everything. Jesus is not just a man who dies on the cross. Jesus is that infinite God made into human flesh to die on the cross. Now, just think of that for a moment. The infinite God, older than the universe, greater than anything we can imagine, actually comes into our time, our space, into this moment. But he doesn't cease being God in that moment when he dies on the cross. I think that is what Dali is trying to point us to the hugeness, the immensity of that moment on Good Friday. A couple of weeks ago, when I was looking at the Velázquez crucifixion, I was talking about that moment of stillness and silence that hushes the world, that I wish to hush the universe. Well, what we've talked about today takes that even further. Next Friday, 3 o'clock on Good Friday, at the beginning of our solemn commemoration of the Passion, I and priests and bishops and the Holy Father throughout the whole world at 3 o'clock will lie prostrate before the altar at that moment. Now, that's always been one of my favourite, probably the wrong word, most moving moments in the whole of the liturgical year. In that moment, as I lie face down before the altar, my mind is opened up to this hugeness of the crucifixion. Not just one man's death, but the death of God made man, of the Word made flesh. Surely that has a cosmic significance. And whether it's Martians, whether it's aliens in our galaxy, or whether it's aliens in a galaxy far, far away, the crucifixion, the infinite God coming into this moment, yes, on this tiny little planet, yes, at this moment in our history, it must have a meaning that stretches beyond everything. So next Friday, on Good Friday, as I lie there in front of the altar, I won't just be thinking of that moment when Jesus died all those years ago. I'll be thinking of what that moment means for me in my space and my time now. But I'll also be thinking of what that moment means for everything. An infinite ripple that stretches instantaneously out through every point of space, every point of time, every dimension, everything that is and can possibly be, because of our infinite God. Thanks for your patience and perseverance in watching today, and also thank you if you've watched all 6 in this series. Happy Holy Week, and when it arrives, a happy Easter to all of you. God bless, and again, thank you.